Okay, so this video I'm recording, this is the first video I'm recording after the first exam. All the other videos where I summarize the concepts were recorded before the first exam. But today I'm still wearing this hoodie for consistency. This hoodie I usually use when I go outside. I don't usually use it indoors. And so the next concept is interpretation of religions, which is not a concept per se, but it's like one component or something that is related to the previous concept of the analogical method. Religion is based on analogy and synthesis and symbolism. And symbolism has, the nature of symbolism is that it is kind of analogous. You use something to represent something else that is kind of analogous to that or becomes analogous to that. So within religions, you have, or mythology, you have symbols, and these symbols are representations, they are psychological representations of visible things. Did I say that correctly? The symbols are, they are psychological. They have a psychological meaning and are represented by things that are from the visible world. And so perhaps I should mention before I continue, I didn't bring this up in the last video, I forgot, but the analogical method is also useful when it comes to like creating your own organization of things, and to create a system where you can remember things, because systems are meant for memorization and transmission. I know that systems and models and such can become like something that becomes very rigid and like interferes, it becomes stagnant or dogmatic instead of representing something open and curious. But one thing that systems and models are useful for is to remember. And so I regard systems more as something like analogy rather than being, it's not reality itself, but it is something that represents reality. So in a sense, even a model like biopsychology or something like spiral dynamics, I view that as something like analogy or symbolism. It's almost the same thing. It's just a bit more sophisticated, a bit more modern, but it's not like spiral dynamics is reality. But it's an interpretation, a symbol for something which is difficult to like talk about in any other way. How do you talk about consciousness when you cannot perceive it? You have to construct some kind of analogous representation, and today we use models and systems, and in the past, well, they also used models and systems, but it was more mythological, it was more like a storytelling and a bit more primitive, I guess, which made it difficult to understand that it wasn't supposed to be taken literally. And so, if we look at something like, if we stick with analogy a bit more, then I should mention that like the formula alpha omega chi omega, for example, I usually talk about that as if it represents timeless principles, but actually it contains fundamental psychology also. It's like a synthesis, and synthesis works based on analogy, so that the A does not just represent like interpretation or interconnection, but it also represents the intellect. Now the formula is like a 3-term and 4-term synthesis, so it contains 3 unique letters, alpha, omega and chi, but it also contains like 4 terms. It repeats the omega, and so it is both a 3-term system and a 4-term system. And as a 3-term system, you can say that represents consciousness, or like space or ether, that which you cannot really define. But when you come to that level, when you can start to define things and say like this is like intellect, and you can start to describe something based on something more manifest, then the intellect is represented by the A, and then emotions are represented by the chi, which falls between A and omega in practice. And so the first omega then is analogous with the sensory motor sphere, or the vital desensitized sphere. And then finally the second omega is a symbol for the body, because the body represents like the beginning of a new world. It's no longer the psychological world, it is like the external world where you are dealing with like organs that function by themselves, and the body is made up of other organisms and things like that. And so you enter into a new world, or transition from the psychological world to like the physical biological world. And so that's why that is like the second A, or that which contains the psyche. The psyche is within the body, so to speak. So that's both analogy and synthesis. And so I didn't bother to like talk about like the synthesis method or something like that, because it's kind of, it goes into the same sort of category. So I just talk about like analogy, the analogical method. But this continues then in religions, where you can, where you have analogies like symbols, like you have the classical elements, and then you have the four types or four classes of animals which correspond to the four classical elements. So you have birds that are analogous to fire, and you have bipedal animals or mammals, which are they have their heads up in the air and they are analogous to air. And then you have the reptiles and perhaps insects which crawl on the ground and are analogous to earth or belong to earth. And then you have the inhabitants of the water, sea creatures. So that's basically what the interpretation of religions in timeless education involves. This idea that it is like these ancient stories are psychological, and they are based on analogy or correspondence between the visible world and the invisible world. And then also the fundamental idea is that it's based on a kind of measurement for truth or wisdom. And at the basis of this, how do you develop like an orientation to find the truth, or to find God, so to speak? And God is like the highest reality, the truth of all truth, so to speak, because everything is like unstable and changing and very complicated in the world. But there is this kind of source of everything. There must be some kind of source, and that would then be analogous to truth, because if you know what the source is, then you can sort of figure out where everything else derived from. And then ancient people arrived at this kind of formula or source code for reality. It's not reality itself, but it represents reality. And that's where you have the concept of the logos and the yin yang and the classical elements and all of these things, like the fundamental components of reality. And so that is related to like the concepts of God, and also karma, and like cause and effect. Basically what drives existence, what makes existence spring forth and constantly change and make things happen. And then of course self-knowledge is also, because religions are psychological, they are also focused on self-knowledge. So basically, religions are, the timeless education is related to religion. I have attempted to take religions seriously, but also I'm also scrutinizing religions, and especially the way other people are interpreting religions. So that is also a component. It's not simply an adherence to religions. It's not like a slave to what ancient people thought, but it's like an evaluation, a kind of attempt to see if there is something worth taking, and then I take it and try to reformulate it. And there is one more aspect of like interpretation of religions and its relation to the analogical method, is that because symbols and things like that, models tends to become fossilized and rigid, it is almost always necessary to like renew, to almost create a new religion or a new philosophy or a new system of thought or teaching or a form of transmitting this kind of essential timeless wisdom. And for that, the analogical method is also useful, because then people can look back and see how things are related, and then in some sense, a new teaching can be reinforced and gain a kind of higher status because it is based on previous, like, established things that people are familiar with, but it is brought up in a new light. And so, if this is like inspired by that, and perhaps that was always that, and so it's like you gain a new appreciation for both the old and the new when you see how they are related. I don't know if that is always the case, but sometimes that can happen, and that's something that I thought was interesting when I started to notice how there are like these much more interesting and sophisticated interpretation of religions that makes more sense. So that was something that was kind of interesting and compelling to me, to not simply disregard the past, but still interpreting religions is not necessarily necessary. So that is like interpretation of religions as a kind of concept. I'm not sure if you can call it a concept, or if I should like rephrase it into a different name, but perhaps something like the law of psychology within mythology, law of psychology within mythology. I don't know. Perhaps you can, perhaps I can develop something a bit more precise to keep in memory, that is easier to bring into sort of like an introductory book, rather than actually going through all of these ancient texts and like interpreting all these stories from various religions, which takes up a lot of time, and I mean it is good for getting the point across, but perhaps one can make something a bit more similar, or more like a kind of brief overview of what is essential about interpreting religions. I don't know, but still I include that as something that is useful to talk about in timeless education.